A spider web of crochet softens the razor wire on a fenced lot. A woman plays solo racquetball in a public toilet. A human cannonball clings to the side of a building. A man with a cow skull, loincloth, and gold lame sneakers, and nothing else, conducts purification rituals on 14th Street. The crosswalk becomes a catwalk. A man in a 7-foot-tall silver costume and a giant bag of Cheetos tries to hail a cab in Manhattan. These are a few examples of the hundreds of visual and performance art pieces that have been showcased in the New York Public Arts Festival, Art in Odd Places, since its inception in 2005. Every October, AIOP curates a week-long panorama of artistic intervention and public engagement along the length of 14th Street in Manhattan. The annual festival attracts scores of participating artists each year, coalescing around a broad theme: invisible, body, race, free, etc., to transform this quintessentially public space into a laboratory of free expression, urban ritual, and the street-level exercise of democratic citizenship. In 2012, AIOP moved beyond its home base in Manhattan and began franchising operations outside New York, organizing festivals in Los Angeles, Boston, and St. Petersburg, Russia. That year, it was also selected as a representative in the US Pavilion for Spontaneous Interventions, Design Actions for the Common Good at the Venice Architecture Biennale. Subsequent years have seen AIOP productions in various other locales, as well as a series of related residencies, lectures, workshops, and other interventions. The mission of AIOP is to reclaim and reinvigorate public space as a site of creative civic engagement, playful and transgressive expression, and provocative open dialogue on issues of the common good. While comprising hundreds of individual pieces, moments, and experiences, the larger aesthetic project of AIOP Festival is to create opportunities for the unexpected, to draw attention to the aesthetics of everyday life, to experience wonder in the everyday, connection with the urban environment, and community with fellow inhabitants. Guide maps are provided for attendees, but guests are also encouraged to explore the festival grounds randomly, to unexpectedly encounter the installations and performances. Primed for an aesthetic experience, all life suddenly becomes ready-made and glows with aesthetic possibility. Most passersby are caught off guard, unaware that there's a festival at all. Accustomed to or oblivious to the daily ritual sideshow of 14th Street, most step over or around the installations. But the delight of those who do register the unexpected presence of art is palpable, and parents with children are particularly susceptible. It is difficult not to pay more attention to one's surroundings after such an encounter and wonder at any intersection, is this art? AIOP was conceived and founded by the multidisciplinary artist Ed Woodham as an act of civic and creative resistance to the privatization, regulation, and securitization of public space in post-9/11 New York and later elsewhere. In form, content, and practice, AIOP demonstrates a model response to the crisis of democracy that is the special focus theme of this conference. And this paper examines the democratic praxis of art in odd places, how its unique combination of theory and practice, history and present, medium and message function as a democratic, social, and artistic practice. The crisis of democracy, characterized today by systemic social, racial, and economic disparities, widespread civic disengagement, and quasi-fascist populism, is not new. The founding fathers in America already lamented the decline of revolutionary spirit and Republican virtue and worried about the dangers of faction. But current trends, events, and technologies have exacerbated the inherent weaknesses and self-contradictions of liberal democracy. Though not explicit, AIOP also has a political mission to leverage the force of art to awaken and invigorate a common sense of civic belonging, responsibility, and purpose that is the theoretical, practical, and spiritual foundation of democracy. Deliberately operating without official status or sponsorship, AIOP lives out the true meaning of the American creed of democracy as the insurgent organizing principle of society, often throwing into critical or ironic relief the ways this founding principle has been degraded by political, corporate, technocratic, and ideological developments in the 21st century. Issuing permits, limited liability, or other tokens of official licensure reasserts a first principle of liberalism, that society precedes the state and retains inherent and inalienable rights over and above it. So, rather than asking permission to express themselves or exercise their civil liberties, the artists and organizers of AIOP hold these truths to be self-evident. Artist and educator by vocation and training, AIOP founder and director Ed Woodham has increasingly made social practice his primary medium. Describing himself as a citizen artist and experience architect, Woodham designs structured social situations and interactions as a means of interrogating public space as a last bastion of democratic practice. While each participating artist in AIOP brings their own aesthetics and intention, the overall effect of the festival is to temporarily shift the tone of the urban environment. Woodham's main artistic contribution here is administrative and managerial, orchestrating and facilitating the work of others. And his work only succeeds if his many collaborators, artists, curators, designers, and pedestrians trust the process and their part in the overall composition. He is an artistic public servant. The democratic praxis of AIOP thus functions on two levels. Operating under the structural constraints listed above requires a high degree of trust, generosity, and self-sufficiency from the participants, and Woodham must approach his work with a democratic spirit to make this anarcho-syndicalist collective function. On the macro level, AIOP also trusts the public to receive and engage with the interventions in a democratic and benevolent spirit, to co-create a carnivalesque atmosphere of joy, tolerance, and civic participation that is the ultimate aim of the AIOP mission, to democratize art and artify democracy. The democratic praxis of AIOP derives from three entwined roots: Mr. Woodham's own background and aesthetic vision, the geographic and cultural context of the festival, and the theoretical insights and contributions of various art movements. AIOP is practically synonymous with Ed Woodham. While each guest curator brings their own aesthetic, each artist their own interpretation of the theme, the overall vision is uniquely his, and the mission and structure of the event have been influenced by his life experience and evolving understanding of the social responsibility of the artist. AIOP is Ed Woodham's particular dream. Moving to New York City from his native rural Georgia, Ed experienced the decadence, turbulence, and squalor of Reagan-era urban decay. The 1980s was a time of crime, drugs, homelessness, and desperation that characterized the city during the crack and AIDS epidemics. But it was also a time of intensity, joy, and creativity, and the young artist experienced the exuberance of street art and graffiti culture, the rise of rap and hip-hop, the spectacle of the gay club scene. The booming but exclusive art market embodied the excess and inequities of the culture, but the gaping social, economic, and cultural divisions still encountered each other on the streets and subways, the democratizing public spaces of the city. So Woodham made it his mission to move art from places of privilege to the street, the site of daily ritual where art regains its purpose and potential to reawaken and reconnect our common humanity. Woodham returned to Georgia in the 1990s, establishing the Atlanta Arts Collective's Living Room in 800 East, and developing his model of artistic collaboration and community that would inform his later design of AIOP. Participation in the city's 1996 Cultural Olympiad, with its scale and explicitly civic mission, in some ways became a harbinger of AIOP. The role of public art in the transformation of Atlanta's famously bereft downtown, in spite of the overall corporate spirit of the Olympic Games, seemed to douse a deeper vein of possibility. Woodham returned to New York in the late 1990s to a city transformed by gentrification, corporate privatization, and draconian policies regulating public space. The broken windows theory of policing, implemented by Commissioner William Bratton under the mayorships of Rudy Giuliani and Michael Bloomberg, had brought a measure of security and investment to some areas, but at the cost of diversity and the cultural integrity of the city. The stop and frisk policies in particular had a chilling effect on civil liberties. The city was being transformed and pacified, destroying the East Village in order to save it. The aftermath of the 9/11 attacks only quickened these trends, and Lower Manhattan went from a war zone to an occupied territory and police state. The cumulative effects of these policies came into full focus during the 2004 Republican National Convention, held that year in Madison Square Garden in Manhattan. W. Bush's invocation of war powers to trump human and civil rights abroad and at home seemed to signal a final act in the crisis of American democracy. Our NC demonstrators were penned in a small, fenced, free speech zone, blocks from the convention center. As Mr. Woodham countered, as an artist and a citizen, I had thought the entire country was a free speech zone. So in response to this rolling crisis of democracy, Woodham conceived AIOP as an antidote to the securitization of public space, constraints on freedom of expression and movement, and the intolerant shift in tone in public discourse. As the Founding Fathers knew, whether in hope or trembling, active citizens, cognizant and confident in their rights and sovereignty, are the best defense against tyranny. Art in Odd Places seeks to reassert a populist claim to the commons, to create a temporary autonomous zone. Ignoring rather than protesting limits on the use of public space is an act of refusal to recognize the legitimacy of authority to regulate public space, and a recognition of the social responsibility of artists to speak and act up. Still, AIOP is not political in any narrow technical sense, but rather pre-political, or even anti-political, engaging the demos rather than the kratos. It is political only in the broadest sense of addressing the politia, the community that is the foundation of the polis. While a few of the pieces in AIOP are clearly political, Yunhai Park's Bodies of Pyongyang, for example, or Jim Desicino's statue of Edward Snowden, most participants invoke democratic principles indirectly by modeling an alternative mode of public affairs and shifting the terms of civic engagement. Rather than asking permission to speak freely, they act as if they are free already and encourage others to explore with them the expressive possibilities of the public realm. Aside from the singular founding vision and executive leadership of Ed Woodham, the geographic, cultural, and historical context of AIOP is another crucial constituent element. Since 2008, the festival's home base has been 14th Street in Lower Manhattan, which in many ways is a natural home for a festival of this kind. 14th Street has long been a human carnival and a busy, thriving intersection of New York's and therefore the world's multiculturalism. It is both a border and a bridge between various life worlds. It divides uptown and downtown, not only cartographically, but socioeconomically, culturally, and psychogeographically, marking the southern border of the perpendicular grid system that characterizes most of the island. It is also one of the few streets that traverse the entire island of Manhattan from the East River to the Hudson. 14th Street anchors meandering Broadway, linking the original theater districts of Rialto and the Bowery. It contains Union Square, haven of street performers, lunatics, and blitz chess players, and long a site of public demonstrations and protests, from the labor rallies of the 19th century to civil rights demonstrations. It was the site of the vigil to the victims of 9/11, as public gatherings below 14th Street were restricted. It is also home for the New School for Social Research, where John Cage's lectures on composition and indeterminacy inspired Fluxus in the 1950s. In its Density, diversity, flow, and connection. 14th Street has an auspicious feng shui as host and headquarters of AIOP, and the festival has become an integral part of the city's cultural calendar. While its site specificity is prototype, AIOP festivals have since 2012 also been produced across the United States and around the world, and each location brings its own character to the mix. A 2012 residency in St. Petersburg, Russia, for example, brought new challenges and opportunities. The invocation of democratic space and free expression has a very different resonance, urgency, and risk in Putin-era St. Petersburg than Manhattan, particularly for gay artists. And the local culture, ordinances, history, and priorities had to be mindfully negotiated. A festival in Greensboro, North Carolina could not but incorporate the city's ambivalent history in the civil rights movement. Even Mr. Woodham's chicken costume had a different semiotic register there than in New York. And a 2018 residency and festival in Charlottesville, Virginia took place in the immediate wake of the infamous white supremacist riot that killed one counter-protester and injured dozens of others. Recognizing and engaging with the legacy and currency of racism in that odd place and time became a central and urgent theme of the event, and the production process evolved into an opportunity for community dialogue, truth, and reconciliation. Site-specific geography, history, and cultural context, what Harm de Bly calls the power of place, plays an active role in the character and significance of public art. Despite Woodham's carny affectations, AIOP is not simply a traveling circus that pitches its tents in an empty field for the amusement, distraction, and fleecing of the locals. It is more like an itinerant country doctor or outside mediator who engages deeply with the local community to come to common understanding, communication, and recommitment. As AIOP travels around the world, it incorporates the history, dialect, and specific concerns of its host sites. Intense organic collaboration with local artists, activists, and community members is a necessary and intrinsic part of the artistic process, and increasingly, perhaps the art itself. Art in Odd Places draws on various art movements, histories, and theories for its aesthetic practice, though all refracted through Mr. Woodham's particular aesthetic and adapted to the specific conditions of the host sites. The idea of using constructed situations to disrupt routine and free one from the alienation of modern urban environment obviously invokes situationism, though Woodham is more public-spirited and a good deal less self-righteous than Guy Debord. His artistic politics are also more informed by anarchism in the Thoreau and John Cage variety than critical post-Marxism of his European counterparts. He's more interested in exploring the latent revolutionary potential of participatory democracy than its overthrow, and is more generous in his estimation of the capacity of ordinary people to be agents of their own emancipation, seeking simply to jostle, not destroy, passersby. The situationist concept of psychogeography is key and critically informs Woodham's practice as an individual artist and ringmaster of AIOP. Artistic disruptions of psychogeographic space, such as Crystal Gregory's crocheted razor wire, shown above, or the supportive bureaucratic interventions of Ori Alon's supporting clerks network, critique the arbitrariness of the physical, political, and legal strictures that shape our lives and suggest the possibility of renegotiating public space in a more creative and democratic spirit. Woodham's version of unitary urbanism is more influenced, however, by urban theorist Jane Jacobs' functional psychogeography than Debord's critical analytic version. In her classic, The Death and Life of Great American Cities, Jacobs lays out a set of practical considerations for boosting autoimmunity from urban blight. Her key concepts of critical density, mixed zoning, diversity, opportunities for leisure and incidental play, and interactive street life create opportunities for community engagement and solidarity, and foster trust, resilience, mutuality, security, and sustainability. They also run counter to the modernist, if not dystopian and systemically racist policies of so-called urban renewal and development. Jacobs' common articles of organic vitality, flow, presence, tolerance, and attention are all central to the mission of AIOP as well. And while incorporating surrealist principles and techniques, Dada is probably a clearer influence on Woodham's aesthetic. Psychology, especially psychogeography, is a clear concern, but AIOP is designed more to awaken the conscious than the unconscious. And the mission is more concerned with Republican virtue than psychoanalytic self-actualization. Fluxus, American Dada 2.0, is also an important precursor and model for AIOP. With its festival format and modes of performance, site-specific intervention, and especially the emphasis on process and transformation, Woodham is open in his respect and admiration for Fluxus artists like Joseph Beuys, John Cage, Yoko Ono, and others. Elements of myriad other art theories and movements can be identified in AIOP, and each participating artist, of course, brings their own perspective. But the overall principles, methods, and goals of AIOP are well-grounded theoretically and historically. Now, theory can be a useful abstraction of the fundamental issues at play in a given situation and an essential tool for navigating crises, but it must incorporate the historical and situational context to have resonance. As Yogi Berra once quipped, in theory, there's no difference between theory and practice. In practice, there is. There may be nothing so practical as a good theory, but it is always also engineered by a few particular people passing through a brief moment in time. This trialectic of theory, context, and artistic subjectivity generates the power and meaning of the democratic praxis of all art in odd places. In conclusion, there are a few general principles that I draw from this case study as it relates to the theme of the function and responsibility of art in the crisis of democracy. Public art has an intrinsically democratic function and can play a constructive, proactive role in engaging public discourse. It should be defiant, but civil, respectful of the limits of tolerance, but willing to chase the dragon's tail. It should be informed by theory, but not rigid or didactic in its application. In theory and practice, it should be gracious, inquisitive, humble, and inclusive in its interactions with local people, culture, and infrastructure. In form and content, the individual freedom of expression of the artist should be balanced with a civic dialogic responsibility. Freedom without responsibility has no civic function, but subordinating individual liberties in the name of collective will or public security diminishes, if not destroys, its democratic function. Done well and in a democratic spirit of critical generosity, art can be a force for personal and social transformation and a guide in navigating the current crisis of democracy, as well as the impending tragedy of the commons. John Cage once said of his own music theory, "It isn't useful, music isn't, unless it develops our powers of audition." In a similar spirit, Woodham believes, and AIOP practices, that public art isn't useful, really, unless it develops our powers of observation and engagement, unless it develops a symbiotic relationship with life. And this is the mission of AIOP, to quote Tyler Durden, a near-life experience. Thank you. And Sláinte.